Well, shellac is definitely one of my favorite finishes. And in this video I like to show you how to achieve a beautiful, deep and rich mirror finish with an old finishing technique from the 18th century called French polishing. Now the first question comes to mind is, what is French polishing? Now let's see what the internet has to say about it. French polishing is a wood finish technique that results in a very high gloss surface with a deep color and chatoyancy. French polish consists of applying many thin coats of shellac dissolved in alcohol using a rubbing pad lubricated with oil. The finish is considered by many to be a beautiful way to finish highly figured wood, but it is also recognized to be fragile. However, it is also simpler to repair. French polishing became prominent in the 18th century. French polishing was commonly used on expensive woods. It was considered to be the best finish for fine furniture and string instruments such as pianos and guitars. Now I know there are already many videos out there showing you how to do French polishing. But since everybody is doing it a little bit different, I thought I'd show you my method of French polishing. So French polishing is a shellac finish. So you can buy your shellac premixed or you can make it yourself. And usually we will take dewaxed shellac, in this case lemon, flakes, and we dissolve 2 pounds of shellac in 1 gallon of alcohol. And that's also called a 2-pound cut. The materials needed for a French polish are obviously shellac, you can buy it in flakes or premixed, and you need alcohol, denatured alcohol. For the pore filling process you'll need pumice, 4F grade, and I use a little sack out of some fabric where I pull the poured pumice in so it's easier to distribute. And you need a polishing pad or a rubber or however you will call it, and it consists of a filling material, for example cotton or wool or cheesecloth or an old t-shirt, and an outer layer made out of linen. Now let's take a look how I make a rubbing pad. The outer layer should be linen. You could also use some t-shirt material or cotton fabric, but linen is considered to be the best alternative because cotton or t-shirt stuff tends to lose some of the fine fibers into the finish. The inner material can be anything you like. For example, these are just some cotton fibers or however you would call it. Sorry, I don't know the right word for this. Or you can use cheesecloth, t-shirt stuff, whatever you like. Some polishers prefer wool. In this case I have an old wool sock that I like to use for the inside material. And it's really very easy to make. Just take your filling material, put it in the middle of this linen sheet. Give it a slight twist. And there is your pad, or rubbing pad, or however you will call it. I call it pad. And the size of the pad depends on the size of your hand and the size of the workpiece you are working on. For example, when I'm working on a big tabletop, I like to use a big pad that fits snugly in my hand and makes the work comfortably. When I'm working on a small piece, for example a small box or a guitar body, then I like to use a smaller pad because it makes it easier to work. For the little piece I'm using today for our demonstration, I like to use the small pad. And in this case I'm not using a linen sheet, I'm using just a piece of fabric, t-shirt material, it's cotton, and I think it will be fine. Okay, and how does the rubbing pad work? Well, obviously it has to be filled with some shellac. In this case I'm using a 2-pound cut. And I also give an equal amount of alcohol to it. Then I twist it and give it a little tap so that the alcohol and shellac will distribute evenly. So that's perfect. The rubbing pad should never be wet, it should always be damp. So that, for example, when you're using it, you will only distribute a small amount of shellac and not make the whole surface wet. And when the pad is not in use, you put it in an airtight container, pour in a little bit of alcohol so that it won't dry up, and you can store it for the next time. Now on this offcut piece of ash glue lamp I like to show you how to do French polishing. And like with every other finish, you really need to prepare the surface by sanding and see that there are no scratches or imperfections on the surface. So let's get started, and since this is an open grain wood, we have to fill the grain. So the easiest way for me is to take an old t-shirt or part of an old t-shirt and put some pumice in the middle, and you want to use the finest pumice you can get. In this case I used 4F. So then we form a little sack, or however you will call it. You can use a rubber band or whatever you have on hand to secure it, and then lightly tap on the wood. And now I'm giving only a few drops of shellac into the pad. And a little bit more of alcohol. And now I'm using circular motions and I'm pushing the pumice into the grain. Now pumice is a stone and it's an abrasive, and you can actually hear it grinding. So I'm not only pushing the pumice into the wood grain or into the wood pores, I'm actually grinding some wood, and the grain will be filled with a mixture of pumice and wood dust. And the few drops of shellac that I used are enough to hold the pumice in the wood grain. Some people use only alcohol, but the problem with this is that once the alcohol evaporates, it leaves only the pumice in the wood grain, and there is nothing that really binds the pumice to the wood. And when you use too much shellac, you run the risk of leaving grayish marks on the surface, because the shellac will actually dry with the pumice on the surface, and this you will have to sand away. So a few drops, very little shellac is really enough. I do need a little bit more of alcohol. At a stage of pour filling, the pad actually can be wet, not overly wet, but it can be wet. And you actually can hear the scraping, the scratching sound. And you also have to be careful because of this abrasive. It can very easily wear out the linen. So as you can see, the linen already starts to wear out. So from time to time I sprinkle a little bit more pumice onto the surface, but never too much. Because what I don't want is that the thin down shellac and the pumice will create some kind of slurry that will dry onto the wood. Now after a few passes you actually can see how the pumice and the wood dust is jammed into the wood pores. So for the actual French polishing I'm using a pad from a previous polish session. Put in a little bit of shellac, 2-pound cut, and about an equal amount of alcohol. And now, basically the same as with the pore filling, I'm starting with circular motions. But this time I make sure that the pad is not too wet. And from now on it's very important that I never stop with the pad, because it will instantly get tacky. Once the pad gets dry, you can recharge it, but you don't need to recharge it with shellac. In this case, it's enough to make it a little bit wet with alcohol, because there is still enough shellac in the pad. And I also can alternate the pattern from a circular motions to a figure eight. The most important thing is never to stop and never to go over the previous layer when it's not already dried. Now at some point you feel a little bit more resistance when you're moving the pad, and then it's a good idea to use 1 or 2 drops of oil. In this case a non-drying oil will be fine, mineral oil, olive oil, whatever you have on hand. It doesn't matter because the oil will not be part of the finish, it only acts as a lubricant and will be removed in the last step. So with the oil you feel that it's not as sticky as it was before and will glide much easier. And once you build up a certain sheen, the pad should feel like when you're using the palm of your hand and you're moving over a piece of glass. It's similar to this feeling. And I'm using light pressure, not too much. Main thing is you never start or stop directly on the wood, because the shellac in the pad will dissolve the finish instantly and you will get burn marks. And when that happens, the only thing you can do is let it dry, sand it down and start from the beginning. Always make sure that you distribute the shellac evenly on the surface. Don't focus on the middle, because this will get enough shellac anyway. When the pad gets dry, add a little bit more shellac and or only alcohol. As I said, usually there's enough shellac in the pad so that a little bit of alcohol should be enough. You see, there's really not much to it. Just takes a little bit of practice and you have to be patient. Most important thing is don't rush through the work. Don't use too much shellac. And after a few sessions you will be rewarded with a very beautiful finish. Every once in a while add a drop of oil. You feel when it's necessary. But don't use too much oil, because this can actually defeat the purpose. And when you're doing everything right, you should see a cloud following the pad where the alcohol evaporates in the oil. That's a good sign that you're making everything right. Also, it's very important to see that the lighting is so that you actually can see the sheen build up, so you can see what you're doing. Now, basically you can do this as long as you like, but I would recommend not to overdo it and give this piece a little bit time to dry and come back a few hours later for the next session. When the pad starts to get dry, you can increase the pressure a little bit, so you actually burnish the finish a little bit and stretching it out evenly. And this will help you prevent any kind of markings that will dry on the surface. And bear in mind, you're not only applying shellac, you at the same time burnish the surface. And this helps to stretch out the shellac evenly, because the shellac that's on this piece of wood is, okay, it's dry to the touch, but it's still very, very soft. So with a little bit of pressure you can even it out. And at the same time apply more shellac. And that's one of the reasons why you should not use too much shellac at once. And the other reason is, when you are using too much shellac, you might see that the surface of the pad will start to gum up. And this is a good indicator for that you are using too much shellac, or too high concentration of shellac, or that you are using too much oil. With a little practice you get a feeling for if you have to recharge the pad with just alcohol or add a little bit of shellac. Once again, the pad should never be too wet. A little bit goes a long way. And I hope you can see the cloud that's following the pad. So I feel the pad start getting dry, and this time I will not refill it, but I will burnish the piece a little bit more, and then I will let the finish cure and come back tomorrow and do a second bodying session. And even though the finish looks very beautiful right now, when I come back tomorrow I know it will sag in a little bit and you will actually see more of the wood grain. So a second and a third and maybe a fourth session is necessary. And while the pad gets drier, I start to increase the pressure so that I really burnish and stretch the shellac out evenly. So I think this will be enough for today. So when storing the pad for the next day, I put it in an airtight container and I pour in a little bit of alcohol so that it stays wet. Hello! So it's the next day and it's now roughly 15 hours since I stopped the finishing process, and I actually can see that the finish has shrunk quite a bit. So I will resume the bodying process. Now at this point I feel a little bit too much friction. The pad is not gliding perfectly. So I put 1 drop of oil on the surface and this will help. Yeah, much better. Now this linen is actually pretty worn out, so I will replace it with a new one. And while I say linen, normally you use a linen sheet. In this case it's just a piece of t-shirt material, which is cotton, but it works fine for me. Although cotton is considered to leave some of the small fibers in the finish. But in this case I don't seem to have a problem with it. But linen is definitely the material of choice. That's almost a little bit too wet. Okay, now I have to work fast. So now that the pad is almost dry, I stop for a few hours and get back to the budding process at a later time. So a few hours have passed and I like to resume the work. And I must say, it looks pretty nice. Now, if you can see some irregularities in the finish, it's not actually the finish, it's the wood, because it's only glue lam. So believe me, the finish itself is absolutely smooth. And I can see or feel I need a little bit of oil. Now that the pad starts to get dry, I increase the pressure slightly, because after this session I like to stop for today, and then I come back tomorrow and then I will decide if another application is needed. Okay, I think that's it for today. So, hello my friends. I let the finish cure overnight and I must say it really looks nice. It didn't shrink so much and still a nice sheen, so I think I will make one last application and I'll be done with it. And I have here a little lamp. And hopefully you can see the reflection, because it really looks nice. So this will be the final application, and once again I refill the pad with a little bit, a few drops of shellac. But only a little bit this time. And a little bit of denatured alcohol. Putting on a drop of oil. So in this step I apply a little bit more shellac, but at the same time I soften the finish a little bit, so that when the pad gets dry I will focus on the burnishing, and maybe I give a little bit more alcohol to the pad when it is too dry. But in this final stage I like to burnish the piece so that I achieve the best quality finish. So it's not so much about applying a lot more shellac, but more about burnishing. And because the shellac will be soft, it's easier to stretch it out and to even all the tiny wrinkles that might be in the finish. And during all these finishing sessions we only used up a very small amount of the shellac, as you can see. So a little bit goes a long way. So when it comes to the materials, shellac is a very inexpensive finish. Of course it's very time consuming and labor intensive, so if you're doing a piece for a customer, This might be an expensive finish. So now that I feel that the pad is starting to get dry, I increase the pressure for burnishing. And when it gets too dry, I put only a few drops of alcohol into the pad so that it is a little bit damp, and I continue the burnishing process. So from now on it's not about applying shellac, but it's only about burnishing. And in my opinion there is no rule on how many shellac applications you do and how long you burnish a piece. It depends on your taste, on your skills, and I would say you are done when you're happy with the result. But I do recommend, when you think everything looks fine, just leave the piece dry for, well, about 48 hours I would say, just to be on the safe side, so that the finish has a chance to dry a little bit and it will shrink a little bit. But I believe in this stage we're in right now, it won't matter too much. And if it really shrinks so that there is another application necessary, then, well, you just do another application. No problem. But you have to be patient. There is no shortcut, and you can't rush through a shellac finish. So, few drops of alcohol. And I guess I have to put on a little bit of oil. So, and remember, in this stage it's not about applying shellac, it's only about burnishing. So I do want the pad to be almost dry, but a little bit damp, only enough alcohol in the pad so that the shellac stays soft while burnishing. So when you look on YouTube or read some articles about French polishing, you'll notice that everybody is doing it a little bit different. In this final stage, while I burnished the piece to a high gloss sheen, some people like to take some abrasive materials and polish it or buff it out. And well, that's fine too, but the problem with this is, in all those sessions you put on a very, very thin coat of shellac. And when you come back with an abrasive and buff it out, you're actually removing material. So I think it defeats the purpose a little bit. But please do whatever works for you. But I must say I like this method more, because in my opinion you get a much better result. When the pad gets almost dry and there really is nearly only alcohol in the pad, you might be able to remove all the oil that's left on the surface in this last burnishing process. But if not, it's not really a problem. I will get back to this piece in a few hours and remove the oil, and I like to show you how, because it's really very easy. So in my opinion, I would say it's finished. And I keep this pad in this airtight container for the next session, whenever this will be. So removing the oil is very easy. You just need a clean rag or cheesecloth, or in this case I'll take a paper towel, and you need some denatured alcohol. And I pour in a little bit of denatured alcohol and then I work it in. The goal is to distribute the alcohol evenly, and what I want is that this paper towel is not wet and it's not damp, it just feels a little bit cold, but it's nearly dry, because when we use it on the surface I don't want to risk destroying the finish by introducing the solvent for shellac. So I actually can feel that it's almost starting to dry, and it feels a little bit cold, and that's what I want. Now I take this paper towel and in fast strokes I go over this piece, take a fresh side, go over, and what it does, it will remove the little bit of oil that's still left on the surface, but without harming the actual French polish. So I think we're done. So as you could see, French polishing is really not so hard to do. It just takes a little bit of practice and a lot of patience. But I really hope you give it a try someday. So thank you for watching and see you next time.